Welcome to Villanova University, the Center for Church Management, and our final webinar in our series on Latino congregations and Catholic foundations. My name is Matt Davis. I'm the Associate Director here in the Center for Church Management. It's my joy and pleasure to welcome you today. So to honor our Augustinian Catholic tradition here at Villanova, I'm going to invite you to pray quietly with me this prayer to invite us to journey more deeply into Lent. So taking a second to quiet yourselves, your hearts, your minds, and quietly pray with me. Almighty and ever-living God, you invite us deeper into your world, your people, your Lent. May our time of prayer lead us to an outward focus, seeking you and those we often ignore. Help us live a Lent focused on inner freedom, generosity, and encounter. Give us hearts hungry to serve you and those who need what we have to give. Amen. So the mission of the Center for Church Management is to provide education and scholarship in the Augustinian Catholic tradition on strategic management and financial matters, in service to leaders of churches and other Christian faith-based ministries. Here in the center, we try to take the best in the management, leadership, business world, and we adapt it and integrate it into what we do to help churches better serve their mission to live and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the center, we have three main branches. Our first branch, our really most important one for us, is our Master's of Science in Church Management. It's a 30-credit degree program from Villanova School of Business. It's a 2-year online program with both live and asynchronous learning. You learn things, deep dives into church finances and human resources for churches and strategic planning for churches. I'm a 2021 grad, just love the program. We're accepting applications now for our 2024 cohort, which starts in May, and you'll be getting a flyer of this program a few days after this webinar is over. We also have 3 non-credit certificate programs. The first is our Church Management, which is an online program. It just gives you a small taste of our master's program. It's 12 1.5-hour lectures done over 9 months. We also have Church Management for Men in Formation. This is a 1-week intensive church management program for people that'll be pastors of churches one day. So it's for seminarians in their last 2 years of study, or priests that have been a priest for less than 5 years. Our last certificate program is our Catholic School Management program, which is for Catholic school administrators, principals, assistant principals, future leaders. It's a deep dive into Catholic school HR and Catholic school finances, things like that. It's 12 asynchronous learning modules done over 12 months. Our last branch is research and scholarship. Some of our research is done by the center itself and with other Villanova faculty. And then we also sponsor researchers from other institutions. We're so kind here in Villanova. We even sponsor researchers from rival institutions and rival basketball teams like St. Joseph University today with Steve Porth. So our agenda for today is, we'll introduce Steve here in 1 second. We'll have him do his presentation. We're going to hold our question and answer at the end. Any questions you have at any time during Steve's presentation, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring it, and I'll give them to Steve at the end. A reminder to keep yourself on mute, and that we'll wrap up today after 1 hour at about 3 p.m. I now want to welcome and introduce Matthew Mannion. He's the David Grennan Family Faculty Director of Villanova Center for Church Management and Master of Science in Church Management program. He's also a professor of practice in the Management and Operations Department of the Villanova School of Business. It's my pleasure to welcome Matthew Mannion.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. And thank you all for being with us here today for the third in this series and what's become a regular function. Kind of we try and do at least once a semester, do these Friday research webinars. So if you've been a part of them in the past, you'll recognize Dr. Steve Porth. He's a professor of management over at St. Joe's University, and he was a research fellow for us twice as part of the Villanova Center for Church Management. We received a grant from the Lilly Endowment as part of their national initiative to address economic challenges facing pastoral leaders. And so as part of that, we've been able to sponsor 32 research projects over the last several years. And so Steve shared one of them with us last fall and is going to share another fascinating one with us today. But he's really, those who saw him before will certainly remember, and those who are seeing him today for the first time, he's an outstanding, not only researcher, but also an outstanding teacher. In fact, he won the Lindbergh Award for Distinguished Teaching at St. Joe's. He's got research and teaching interest in organizational strategy, ethics, servant leadership, and this topic of managing financial challenges faced by church leaders. He also served as 17 years as Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Graduate Programs in the Business School at St. Joe's. And yes, we have a nice sports rivalry. He was the NCAA faculty athletic representative at St. Joe's, and has been on several governance boards outside of the academy, including serving on the board of directors of Nutritional Development Services, which is part of Catholic Human Services here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and Hoops for Hope in Philadelphia, and was the former trustee of the board of Sacred Heart Academy. And so Steve is going to share with us his research on Catholic foundations, this analysis of governance structures, transparency, and financial performance. Steve is presenting for us. He's been part of this research fellowship, as we said, for a couple of years. And do want to thank again Lily for their support, as well as the members, the other benefactors of the Center for Church Management. I see a couple members of our advisory council here, including our chair, Mike Castellano, and one of our other council members, Ed Mackesy. But all those folks who provide the funding for this kind of research, it's a big part of what the mission of the center is in trying to support church leaders. But Steve has presented for us several times, and we were joking that even though St. Joe's University is literally only 15 minutes down the road from Villanova's campus, I think out of the 4 presentations Steve has done for us, he's only done 2 of them in person. And so one of them he was presenting while he was at a conference in Rome in the Vatican. And today he joins us from Mexico City, where he's visiting his daughter and his grandchildren. So we really appreciate you taking the time away from family to share these insights with us and to share the fruits of your research, Steve. So we'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. And it's a pleasure to be here and to see everybody. Thanks for your interest in my project. I am going to share my screen, so just bear with me for 1 second. There we go. You can see my screen now, right? Great. So first of all, as I said, it's a pleasure for me to be associated with this this project with Villanova University with the Center for Church Management, and Matt have been just fantastic to work with. So I want to thank you guys for all your help and support. As Matt mentioned, I am now doing my second project for the Center for Church Management. My first one focused on how Catholic elementary schools are funded. My wife and I have 5 children, all of whom went through Catholic education for actually 16 years through college. Our youngest is now a senior at St. Joseph's University. So we can almost see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of tuition payments and so on. But obviously committed to our faith and to to the church. And this was a way for me as a business professor to bridge those 2 areas of my life. I teach business, but of course, in terms of the Center for Church Management, it focuses on these types of issues, human resource, financial issues. So this was a perfect marriage of my commitments and my values and my interests. So let me tell you about this particular project. As Matt mentioned, I focused on an emerging phenomenon, really, is Catholic foundations. And I wanted to know more about what they do, how they do it, how they're governed, who's involved in their governance structures. And then I looked at financial transparency and financial performance. So what do I mean by a Catholic foundation? This is taken from the website of the Catholic Foundation of Northern Georgia. These are foundations that attract, manage, and invest funds to support dioceses, to support the financial needs of parishes, schools, charities, or whatever other missionary work there is to be supported from financial point of view. The focus of this study is not on a foundation that is specific to a school, whether it's a high school or a hospital, but foundations that are associated with dioceses and the needs of the entire diocese. So that's an important distinction I wanted to make. Why use a foundation? Well, I think there are three good reasons. Number one is these are vehicles to effectively fundraise that are staffed by professionals, people who are trained in the field. They understand investing, they understand fundraising. So you have professionals who are responsible for that financial aspect to support the church, to support the diocese. And then the third bullet point is equally important, and that is that these funds are often in a foundation that's legally separate from the diocese. So those funds are protected, and that's an important issue, as we know. I'll touch on it as we go. Now, why did this attract my attention? This slide, I think, is the answer to the question. Catholic foundations have been around for decades, but not a lot was happening until I'd say around the year 2000, and there's been an explosive growth of the formation of Catholic foundations. So you can see this. The latest study that I've seen on this was done in 2021, where there was a count of 190 foundations in the United States associated with dioceses. So clearly, this has been a trend that has accelerated in recent years, and there's very little research on what they do, how they do it, etc. So that's what attracted my attention, and that was really the focus of my thinking. Why are these foundations forming? Well, I don't have to tell you, 32 dioceses in the United States have filed for bankruptcy since 2004, and last year alone, 5 dioceses filed for bankruptcy. So while that's happening, we also see this. This is just a screenshot from Reuters of an article that focused on the growth of Catholic foundations, not just the number, but the funds that they're managing. At this point, well over $10 billion in funds. So there's a lot happening, and I wanted to know more about it. So what's the purpose of my study? Well, I wanted to look at these foundations, better understand their governance structures, better understand the financial transparency of the foundations and their financial performance. The study is based on 114 foundations in the United States. It attempts to answer 4 questions. Number one, what's the size and makeup of the governance boards of the foundations? Who's on the board? How many people? What are some of the demographics of the board members? And what about the role of the bishop? Is the bishop on the board or not? Those are the types of questions I investigated. Secondly, financial transparency. Does the foundation disclose its financial statements? Is it easy to find the financial results of the foundation? And I'll go into that. But in particular, I wanted audited financial statements, and that means either IRS Form 990, which most of you are probably familiar with, or an audited financial statement. And I was able to find those statements for most of the foundations in the study. Also, there's a database, GuideStar, that most people who are active in the nonprofit space would be familiar with. And GuideStar has information on thousands of nonprofits and also hundreds and hundreds of foundations. So I explored GuideStar for what was available about the foundations there. So basically, I'm looking at the websites of the foundations, and I'm looking at GuideStar as my primary sources of information. Thirdly, what about the financial performance of the foundation? So what is the size of the assets that they're managing, and what's the 4-year growth rate of those assets? So I was able to make comparisons between foundations based on the growth of their assets over the 4-year period of the study. Finally, what are the interrelationships between these 3 variables, meaning the way that the governance board is structured, the degree of financial transparency, and the performance of the foundation over the period of study? Are there any relationships between those 3 variables? So that was the focus of my study, and I think I found some pretty interesting results, which I'd like to share. First of all, how do I how did I identify these foundations? I used the official Catholic directory. Again, probably a resource that you're familiar with, published annually. Each diocese enters data and updates that data on an annual basis, and it is confirmed by the diocese. And included in that is whether or not there are foundations within the diocese, and if so, the name of the diocese and a little bit of background information about them. So I was able to, through that process, almost like reading a telephone book, by the way, I was able to find 114 foundations. Okay, let's get into some of the results. The first thing I looked at is who serves on the governance boards. And I found a very interesting finding, I thought, was that you could define the type of governance board based on the role of the bishop on the board. So I found that the bishop was the chair of the board in 38% of the foundations that I studied. Now, let me backtrack for just a second. There's 114 foundations in my study, but not all of them disclosed even who is on the board. But 104 of them disclosed all members of the board, and 107 disclosed whether or not the bishop was on the board. So this is based on 107 foundations. So 38% of those were chaired by the bishop of the diocese. That's model one. Model two, the bishop serves on the board, but not as its chair. That was about 33% of those foundations. And then the third model was that the bishop doesn't have any role on the board, and that was about 29% of the foundations in the study. So pretty even distribution based on those three different models. Okay, then I looked at particular characteristics of the board based on the type of model. And you can see here one dimension, if we look at the second column of this table, was what was the average size. There was no statistically significant difference between the three models in terms of the size. So roughly you're talking about 14 to 17 or 18 people is a pretty typical size. Then I looked at the percent who are female, and again, no significant difference in the percentage of female board members between the three different models. The other two variables I looked at, though, there were significant differences, and that had to do with the percent of clergy, priests and religious sisters and deacons as well, versus lay people. And model one had a tendency, statistically significant, to have a higher proportion of clergy serving on the governance board, about 21.5%, compared to model three, which is about 15%. So that was a significant difference. And likewise, the last column of this table, percentage of independent, and what that means is how that's defined as independent are board members who are not employed by the diocese. So many of the boards might include the CFO of the diocese, or the superintendent of schools, or the director of stewardship. Those would all be people who would be employees of the diocese. So this last column also shows the statistically significant difference in a model one board, which is a board chaired by the bishop. It is more likely to have people who are employees of the diocese than would be a model three board, which is chaired by a lay person and does not include the bishop. Okay, now transparency. There's a couple different forms of transparency that I looked at. Number one is a very basic form of transparency, which is, does the foundation even disclose who's on the board? That's a pretty minimum level of disclosure. And happy to report that 104 out of 114 do disclose every member of the board, most of them with a picture of the person and a very brief bio, where they work, and a little bit about their background. However, 10 don't disclose any information, even a name of who's on the board. So that was an interesting finding. Now, what about that and financial disclosure? So On the left, you have 104 boards that disclose their identities of the board members versus the ones that don't disclose the identity of the board members. And you can see, probably not surprisingly, those two groups are very different in terms of their level of financial disclosure. So the ones that disclose the identity of the board members, 80% of those are also financially transparent. They make their audited financial statements available to the public. On the other hand, in the 10 that don't disclose the identity of board members, only 3 of those disclose any financial statements. So those differences, that's why it's in yellow. Anytime you see yellow, it's a statistically significant difference. So those two groups are very different from each other in terms of not only disclosing board members, but also disclosing the financial results of the foundation. Okay, then I went further on financial disclosure, comparing the 3 models. And again, I found what I thought was pretty interesting results. So Model 1, chaired by the bishop, 63.4% of those foundations are disclosing their financial statements publicly. Model 3, the bishop has no role on the board. 97% of those foundations are disclosing their financial statements. So again, a significant difference. I went further on this one by combining models 1 and 2 and comparing them combined to model 3. And again, I found a statistically significant difference at a very high level of significance. So that's what this says. When I combine models 1 and 2, they're different than model 3. So basically what this means is that if the bishop serves on the board, either as a chair or as a board member, it's less likely to disclose its financial statements than if the bishop is not on the board. Okay, the next way I looked at financial transparency was through GuideStar. I could go deeper into this, but I won't. If there are questions, I have some specifics on this. But GuideStar has a financial transparency rating, and there are 4 levels of transparency. And if you're engaged with GuideStar, which many of the Catholic foundations in my study were, they are awarded a level of financial transparency based on how much information the foundation provides them. So what you can see here, I found that probably the most notable finding here was the lack of ratings. So over 75% of the foundations had no GuideStar rating. And I actually just last week, I was followed up on an interview. I didn't mention this earlier, but when I started my study a year ago, I interviewed 5 senior leaders of foundations, mostly in the president's role. So I circled back and talked to one of them last week, and I was talking to him about this. And he thinks that this is reflective more of just education, that he wasn't all that familiar with this. But again, I can show you that there are well, somewhere close to, I guess it's 28 if I do my math real quick, or 38 foundations that do have GuideStar ratings, but most did not. Okay, so not a lot to talk about there. Okay, the last part of my study focused on the financial performance of the foundation. And again, I looked and compared the 3 models of governance, as you can see in the left-hand column. The next column is just the average size of the assets in fiscal year 22. Fiscal year 23 just wasn't available yet for most of the foundations. So that's why I didn't use fiscal year 23. It just wasn't available. But you can see the size of the endowments that these different foundations on average are managing. So $92 million Model 1, over 100 million Model 2, and over 80 million for Model 3. The next column is the compound annual growth rate. So I I got this data for 2018, 19, 20, 21, and 22. So that's a 4-year period. And I looked at what was the growth rate of the total value of the assets that the foundation managed over the 4-year period. And then I compared the 3 models to see if there was any statistical difference. Now, the right-hand column, the last column there, this is an important point. The data wasn't available for all of the dioceses, all of the foundations, I should say, for a couple of reasons. Number one, some of these foundations were actually less than 4 years old, so I couldn't get 4 years of financial data. Some of them, it was just spotty in terms of 1 year they did have financial statements posted, the next year they didn't. So what that meant ultimately was that I could only do this analysis on a total of 71 of the foundations. And again, I had 114 foundations in the original study. So that did reduce my sample size. And I think that's an important thing. I do think that if I had more data, probably would have found more here. But I did find one statistically significant difference, as you can see here in yellow, between Model 1 and Model 2. Model 2 was the highest performing foundation over the 4-year period, and it was higher than Model 1. It's not statistically higher than Model 3. That's why that's not highlighted in yellow. So the only difference here was between Model 1 and Model 2. The question is why? And to be honest, I'm not sure why. I'd love to hear if anybody has a hypothesis about why Model 2 outperforms Model 1. I did ask this question to the president of the foundation who I met with last week, and he had a couple of ideas. But anyway, I'm not sure why I'd love to hear your ideas on that. Okay, in conclusion, what I did with this study was as far as I know, for the first time, dove into these questions about financial transparency and financial performance. There have been a few studies done by Wilmington Trust. In fact, 3 studies that the Wilmington Trust has done on Catholic foundations, but that's more descriptive data. It's great data, but it's descriptive. How many, what's the size of their assets? So I haven't seen any studies that have dove into these types of differences. So I think I shed some new light on Catholic foundations. I discovered 3 different models of governance, as I mentioned, based on the role of the board, and I discovered some statistically significant differences between those models based on the proportion of clergy and the proportion of employees, diocesan employees that serve on those boards. I looked at financial transparency and found this is good news, I'd say. I mean, there's always 2 ways to look at things. The good news is that 80% of foundations disclose their audited financial statements, and they make it pretty easy for the public to go on a website or to search GuideStar and to find their audited financial statements. So in a way, we could say that's a really positive finding. On the other hand, and the other thing I should add is they're not required, because of an exemption that religious institutions have, they're not required to disclose their financial statements, and yet almost 80% of them do. So again, that's the good news. From my point of view is, why isn't it 100%? So I wonder about the 24, 25% who are not disclosing. My math is off. 22, 23% who are not disclosing. So anyway, I do think it should be 100, but I'm pleased to see it's close to 80. When the bishop either chairs the board or is a member of the board, the foundation is less likely to disclose its financial statements. So that's certainly something to think about. And finally, financial performance over the 4-year period. Model 2 outperformed Model 1 foundations. A couple of implications, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Again, good news over, well, close to 80%, 78% do disclose, but why not 100%? Transparency, and this is my view, this is my opinion, why not 100%? Number one, it's just good. It's right. It's the right thing to do. Transparency, especially as we all know, in the Catholic Church, has never been more important than it is right now. So I'd like to see this uh, financial transparency for that reason. But there's a business case for being financially transparent as well. And that is, if you look at some prior research that's been done, and thanks to Matt Mannion, he shared this with me. Chuck Zeck, who was the founder actually of the Institute for Church Management, and a colleague, found that almost roughly half of Catholic parishioners felt that they had enough information about the parish finances compared to 75% of Protestant congregation members. But I think this is even more interesting, that those that did feel confident that they had enough information about the financial condition of their parish contributed 32% more than those that didn't. So financial transparency is important for both reasons. One, it's the right thing to do. And two is because I think it does in fact lead to more engagement, more participation, and more trust. As I mentioned, the GuideStar ratings were surprising to me in that there were very relatively few foundations that did have GuideStar ratings, although there were a significant number that did. And as I mentioned, this could be just a matter of education, because if foundations are posting their financials, there's no reason not to share them with GuideStar. Because that's a source of information that a lot of people are checking in the nonprofit field. Identify board members and post financials. I think this is a minimum expectation from my point of view of what should be expected. And then Catholic foundations are doing great work. Let's tell our story. And I think part of telling our story is letting people know, how we're doing financially, who's on the board, and what are some of our success stories. There's so much good news to tell, so we should be shouting it from the rooftops. And when we do, I think it's going to help us to be even more successful in fundraising. So that's my perspective. Would love to hear any questions from you.
Well done, Steve. Thank you so much. I know Matt's got some questions for you. Just one comment on the GuideStar piece you just talked on there. And I know Matt Huffnagel asked the question in the chat as well in terms of the value of it. So I'm curious if you have a perspective on it, Steve, but two things I would offer for the group here. One is actually just in the last year or so, GuideStar is rebranding. So you can still find it under guidestar.org. You can also find it under Candid. So either one is the same website. They just went through a rebrand thing. But I would tell you, as someone who's worked in the nonprofit sector before, it doesn't cost anything other than a little bit of work to make sure that your record is up to date. So if you don't know that there's public information about you on GuideStar, you should. And it's real easy to get it to be accurate and to reach out to them and give them what the information that you want to share. So it's a really low lift to get it. But there are some donors who look at GuideStar before deciding to make a decision about where they're going to support things. And so, again, people give to people as the primary, but when they're doing the due diligence, it's one of the places that people look. So given that it's relatively easy to keep it updated, and knowing that some people look there before making decisions, I don't have any data on how it impacts giving and generosity, but just say if it impacts anybody for the relatively low lift, it seems like an easy place to have it, telling the story you wanted to tell. You can even put the narrative in there, to your point, Steve, about telling the story. Like you can offer that all to them and they'll post it for you. So from our perspective, it's free advertising for prospective donors and benefactors. So Steve, I don't know if you had anything else you want to say about GuideStar or Candid.
I do, Matt. Actually, it's a perfect segue. I had a couple backup slides because I was anticipating maybe some questions on GuideStar. So I'm just going to show these two backup slides, Matt. They speak directly to GuideStar. Let me do that.
I did not know you had them in there. In the interest of full transparency,
No,
here. This is unscripted.
we did not coordinate this ahead of time, but so this is what I have. So these are the four different categories or ratings for GuideStar. It goes bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. Bronze is just sharing basic information of your EIN, the name of your foundation, who serves on your board, etc. Then silver involves sharing your financials, as you can see. And then each successive seal includes everything in the prior seal plus new. So gold is you're not only sharing your financials, but you're talking about your goals and your capabilities. And then finally, platinum is where the foundation shares all that plus what their outcomes were. And so that's where you can really trumpet some of your, your great outcomes from the different causes or missions or ministries that you are funding. And also, I want to say this too. This is a spreadsheet of the foundations and what level of GuideStar transparency they do have. So you can see that this isn't totally unknown. This is not a complete unknown to foundations in the study. And it goes everywhere from the bronze level all the way up to the platinum. So we do have, 5 different foundations in the study that I did have platinum level GuideStar rating. So it's not a complete mystery. And I think that if the word gets out, just like Matt said, there's no cost to doing this, and there's every good reason to do it. Maybe that would be an outcome of my study. I hope it is.
Great, thanks, Steve. I'm gonna keep firing you some questions from the chat box if that's okay. And if you have other questions, anyone, please put them in now. Steve, our first question's about socially responsible investment guidelines. I'll just read it. So as the US bishops have approved socially responsible investment guidelines since the early 1990s, do you recall seeing any transparency about how foundations adhere to those guidelines? Did any share their investment policy statements publicly? Do any report how they vote their proxies?
Yes, I did see many examples of foundations clearly stating on their websites just what you said, Matt, and that they adhere to those principles. But we're not even close to 100%. I didn't track it. I can't give you hard numbers, but I can tell you that a significant number of the foundations do have narratives about their policies and being in compliance with the bishop's, what was the name of, I'm sorry, what's the name of that again, Matt? The
So,
bishop's.
they wanted socially responsible
Yeah,
investment. Is that what you mean?
yeah. And then there's a particular uh, policy.
Investment policy
Yeah,
statements.
yeah, exactly, from the bishop. So yes, that's available on many of the websites, but not but by any stretch, not all.
Great. Another question was, I think people positing why the foundations with the bishop as the chair were not doing as well financially in terms of what their investments were making. There were some questions. One person said, could it be the risk aversion of the bishop? Another said maybe it's performance differences attributable to donor restrictions. Any sense of why I think it was 4% is what the foundations with the bishop as the chair. Those are some posits. Any other thoughts on that, Steve, what that could be?
Yeah, I could go up to that slide. So this is the one that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, if it was the influence of the bishop, then what I would have expected was that Model 3 would outperform Model 1 and Model 2. In other words, if it was possible that the bishop was more conservative in terms of uh, financial investing, then that would have been reflected in a higher level of performance for Model 3 foundations. Now, Model 3 foundations did well here, but they didn't statistically outperform Model 1. So statistically, there isn't evidence to support that conclusion. However, this is what is a little baffling, and that's why I was turning this question back to the audience here, is wondering whether anybody had a theory as to why a Model 2 board, which is not chaired by the bishop, but the bishop does serve on the board, would outperform a Model 1. I asked this question, by the way, to the president of the foundation who I was speaking with last week. I showed him this PowerPoint. And a couple things, even before I tell you that. First of all, I have to say, and I did say this earlier, this is based on a really small sample size. We only have 24, 25, and 22. So I think we would find more statistically significant results if I had the full range of data on 114 foundations. But because it just wasn't available, it reduced the sample size, which reduces the statistical power of the tests that you're doing. So that's one thing. But another thing is this. 2022 was a really bad year for investing for all of us. 2023 was a great year. The stock market, was made up and then some what it lost in 2022. So 2022 was a rough year. Now, here's the point. If these foundations aren't all following the same fiscal year, and they're not, some might have a calendar year as their fiscal year, some might have June as the end of the fiscal year, we could, to a certain extent, be comparing apples to oranges here. So that's part of what I'm thinking. Between the fact that the sample size was cut down so much, number one, and number two is, since 2022 was such a rough year in terms of financial performance of endowments and investments, and if they're not all following the same fiscal year, that could account for some difference.
Interesting.
It is an interesting one, Steve, and again, we were so struck by this one. This is one of the many findings that we had a lot of conversations about as an opportunity for more research. So it's one of those good research things where, like, this is a really interesting finding that warrants more research. So I think those couple of things are possible. I mean, another hypothesis too is that, between 1 and 2, potentially, if the bishop is chairing, there could be more risk aversion, not only in the bishop, but also in the other members, even the independent members who are serving on it. There could be a tendency towards conservatism and trying to protect the assets of the thing.
Sure.
What's interesting is, and this is just a hypothesis, but for Model 3, where it's all lay folks, there could almost be an unconscious bias towards conservatism there too, because they're not playing with their own money, they're playing with the church's money.
Sure.
And so in Model 2, where the bishop is there, but is not chairing, that might overcome some of that bias towards conservatism. So it could be any other factors too, but there could be that play from a organizational behavior standpoint.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting interpretation. And like you said, Matt, that's a good hypothesis. I like that. And it could be further explored. So what I'm going to be doing here with this study, at some point I have to say, okay, it's over. But I'm going to go back one more time and see if I can get more data so that these ends can be increased. And if so, that might produce some different results. But I think your hypothesis is interesting, Matt, that the bishop's on the board, so we don't have to worry about him being, not in support of this, yet he's not the chair of the board, so maybe they feel that they can be a bit more aggressive in their investing. That's an interesting possibility.
Steve, the one other thing, I'm just seeing Mike Castellano, who has extensive investment experience in a lot of places, Mike, so appreciate that. But the potential, is there any difference in these sample sets of the liquidity needs of those dioceses? And might that be a driver of it that's actually independent of the makeup of the board, but it just happens to be dioceses that have more short-term liquidity needs versus other ones?
Yeah,
I don't know how you find that.
I wanted to, when I first started this study, as you know, Matt, I also had the value of grants awarded as a measure of financial performance. So not just what's the value of the assets you're managing, but how much money you're actually awarding to the diocese to support the ministries of the diocese, which is obviously also, I mean, that's the whole purpose of these foundations, right? But the problem with getting that information is even for the foundations that were disclosing their financials, that information was less available. The value of the assets, everybody reported. The value of the grants awarded, it just continued to shrink the sample size, so it made it impossible for me to make any meaningful comparisons. But that would be ideally what I would like to have done.
Interesting.
I had one question, Steve. This is just positing. Is there any study on the degree of transparency of these foundations and the number of lawsuits that happen? For example, dioceses that are less transparent get less lawsuits, and dioceses that are more transparent get more lawsuits because people can see what money they have. I don't know if that makes sense at all, or
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. And actually, one of the things that I have in my data collection, which I haven't included in this presentation, is I have a rating of every diocese from the Voice of the Faithful. The Voice of the Faithful does a transparency rating of every diocese. So I have that figure. And what I can do is I can look for correlations between the Voice of the Faithful diocese rating versus the transparency of the foundation relative to the diocese. So in other words, if the diocese gets a higher rating overall, does its foundation also get a higher transparency rating? That's something that I have the data to explore.
great. Well, I think we're going to start to wrap things up. First, a huge thanks to everyone attended today. Hope you got some new insights about Catholic foundations. Special thanks to Steve Porth for sharing his research and insights with us. We're recording this presentation along with the flyer for the Master of Science in Church Management program. I'll email that out to you in the next few days or so to share with others you think may be interested or for yourself. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to stop the recording in a second. If you have an individual question you want to ask Steve, he'll stay on for a minute or two afterwards. Otherwise, have a wonderful weekend and many blessings.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Steve.